popular around the world, and it is known as the ketogenic diet or the low carb diet. And really, it's been around for a long time, and you may know it as the Atkins diet. Again, this is where we have the typical American diet, as you can see right here. And as you can see in this, about 50% of the diet is carbohydrates. And that is significantly reduced when you get to the Atkins diet. You can see that most of the diet is made up of this purple slice, the majority of which is dietary fat. So it's a high-fat diet, high-protein diet. The classic ketogenic diet is this 4-to-1 diet where you have a small amount, even smaller amount of carbohydrates. And then you have this ketogenic diet as well, the MCT as it's known as, and that's with lots of oils. Okay, so in all of these situations, the reason why people are cutting down on carbs is to get the body to burn more fat. And the question today that we're going to raise is whether or not this is a healthy diet or not. One of the things that I have a concern about this type of diet just up front is that not all carbohydrates are the same, right? You can get carbohydrates from fruit juices. You can get carbohydrates from soda, fructose, all of these sorts of things. And those chemically, when you break it down, are similar to the carbohydrates that you would see in fruits and vegetables, except in fruits and vegetables, they're packaged very differently. They are packaged complex so that when you digest it, there's a slow release. And that obviously has a lot to do with the health benefits or health detriments. So I think right up front, we just have to realize that it's not the best way to classify things just very simply in terms of carbohydrates, because there are complex carbohydrates and there are refined carbohydrates, and those act very differently. But nevertheless, this is a very common diet that people are going on now, and there has recently been some long-term data that has just come out from the Nurses' Health study that was published by the AHA in their journal, and we're going to take a look at it. First one that we're going to look at is this abstract that was published at the most recent meeting, and it's going to be published in Circulation. Here is the abstract, and it looks at low carbohydrate diets and risk of type 2 diabetes in U.S. men and women. So we're looking at the United States. We're looking at the Health Professions Follow-Up Study, which involved quite a number of people and years to follow up with. So this is a prospective study in 203,000 men and women participating in the Nurses' Health Study, the NHSII, and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, who were free of type 2 diabetes. So these were people that did not have type 2 diabetes at the beginning of the study. And then they looked to see how much type 2 diabetes occurred prospectively. And they followed them for actually 30 years. So this is the first thing I want to talk about here is a lot of times people go on these diets and they say within a year or two they start to feel better. And the question really is, because cardiovascular disease, because diabetes takes decades in some cases to come to fruition, can we really say that there's a benefit of low-carb diets in the first 2 to 3 years? So the way to find that is to actually look for decades to see whether or not this type of diet is associated with better outcomes in terms of diabetes. So that's what we're going to look at here. So they looked at 5 low carbohydrate dietary scores based on sources of protein, fat, and carbohydrate differentiated by their qualities. And these were derived every 4 years based on dietary assessments by a validated food frequency questionnaire. So they took these 203,000 men and women and followed them for 30 years. And every 4 years, they would check in with them to see if they had adjusted or changed their diet. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of person-year follow-up time. Okay, that's over 5 million person-years of follow-up. During that time, there was almost 20,000 new cases of type 2 diabetes in this population. And so the question is, in which groups did they happen? Where did type 2 diabetes pop up? Because some of these people did not adopt a low carbohydrate diet. Some of them did. And so it'd be interesting to find out if in the population of people with generally low-carb diets, did these have their fair share of diabetes or were they missing? That's the question. So they did something really interesting. They actually looked at scores. And so here, let's take a look at the scores. There's the overall LCD score. The LCD is the low carbohydrate dietary score, okay? They looked at unhealthy scores based on things like age, ethnicity, smoking status, BMI, alcohol, multivitamin use, physical activity, total energy intake, family history of diabetes, hormone replacement therapy, and OCPs. And they found a healthy score and an unhealthy score. So out of all those people who had low carbohydrate intake, okay, and they actually had scores for this. Okay, the more they were low carbohydrate, the less they were. And they actually divided it into quartiles. So quartile 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I guess it's quintile, not quartile. So what they did was they looked at these and they found that people who had healthier and healthier scores, okay, so let's take a look at this one right here, healthier and healthier scores. And so in this reference line here, these were the ones that had the lowest levels of health. Those that had the second level of health factors that we see here, their chances of getting diabetes went down by 6%. Those that were had even more healthy scores went down by 14%. Those that had even more healthy went down here by 10%. And those that were even more healthy, the healthiest, you could say, they went down by 15%. Now notice here that none of these scores include the number 1, and so what you can conclude is that these are all statistically significant, and by the way, the trend was statistically significant as well. So no real surprise here. The healthier they were, the more it went in that direction, and there was a trend. So that makes sense. Now, what about an unhealthy LCD score? So for those that had unhealthy attributes, the risks went up. So here we have our reference, 17% increase, 23% increase, 35% increase, 39% increase. And again, it was statistically significant. Okay? Now, let's look at the overall LCD score. So those people that had better and better scores in terms of more in-depth low carbohydrate scores, notice what happened here is that as they had more and more of this low carbohydrate, in other words, the more and more they had low and lower carbohydrates in their diet, scores went up. In other words, the hazard ratio went up. Here, this was a 7% increase, 12% increase, 20% increase, 28% increase in those that had the most low carbohydrate diets for risk for diabetes type 2. All right, now I've saved the last two for the best here. Let's look at animal-based LCD scores. So we're looking at how much of their dietary protein and fat came from animals. And again, here's the reference. And as we start to go up, notice that we go up by 11%, 17%, 26%, 35% risk of developing diabetes. So in other words, if you do a low carbohydrate diet, and the more you incorporate animal products into that diet, in a dose response curve, we can see here that the statistically significant trend is there, that the more and more you incorporate animal proteins and animal fats into your diet, the higher the risk for diabetes. Now, if you want to have low carbohydrate diet, but instead you are incorporating vegetable or plant-based dietary proteins and fats, notice here what the difference is. Notice here that already, even in the second quartile, you've already had a 4% reduction in diabetes. Now, this does include 1, so some may argue that's not statistically significant. But notice that as you start to go down, here this is 1.01, so again, but here that we get to quartile 4 and 5, we start to see that there is actually a reduction in diabetes with carbohydrate reduction, and that was still statistically significant even at that point. So this is a pretty powerful study. It's prospective, and it looks at 30-year differences. So this low-fat diet has been around for more than 30 years. This goes back to the 70s, 80s, okay? And we can see, based on questionnaires about what these people were eating over this period of time, what the true incidence is of diabetes. Okay, so let's not talk about diabetes. Let's talk about something that's even more important, and that is death. So for that, we go to a different article, an article titled Low Carbohydrate Diet Scores and Mortality Among Adults with Incident Type 2 Diabetes. So here in this article, there was 10,101 incident type 2 diabetes cases, contributing to 139,000 person years during follow-up. And they documented 4,595 deaths, of which 1,389 cases were attributed to cardiovascular disease and 881 to cancer. Let's take a look at the data in this case. This is part of the same cohort, some of the same authors on this one. All right, so we've got a graph here that we've got to unpack. And I particularly want to pay attention to those here in the upper brackets. Okay, so we're looking at pooled hazard ratios of actually dying. Okay, and that's per of low carbohydrate diet scores among people with type 2 diabetes. So we're now looking at people who've actually developed type 2 diabetes, and we want to know if they go on a low carbohydrate diet, what is the risk of that? So let's take a look here. Total low carbohydrate diet scores, okay, all of them put together, there's actually a reduction in the mortality per increase in 10 points of low carbohydrate diet scores. Okay? And you can see here by the hash bars that it's statistically significant because it falls below unity. All right, what happens if the majority of those carbohydrates, or let's say even protein and fats, come from animals? So that's this yellow one. Notice here that the hash bar is exactly at 1. So one may argue that may not be statistically significant reduction. So it's actually a weaker source of survival here if you have animal low carbohydrate diet. Next one is the vegetable low carbohydrate diet score. And as you can see, significantly reduced in all-cause mortality hazard ratios. If we have the unhealthy low carbohydrate diet scores, notice that there is no statistically significant benefit in terms of mortality. And the healthy low carbohydrate diet score, those are the people that don't smoke, things of that nature. When you pull that together, you can see that the best thing really to do is to not smoke, not drink, exercise, and have a low carbohydrate diet in this case, where the majority of the fats and the proteins come from plants. You can see here back in that study that looked at the incidence of diabetes, to evaluate the quality of the diets, the foods people ate were classified into 18 groups. Whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, vegetable oils, tea, and coffee, fruit juices, refined grains, potatoes, sugar, sweetened beverages, sweets and desserts, animal fat, dairy, egg, fish, or seafood, meat, and miscellaneous animal-based foods. And again, on that first study that we showed, which looked at the incidence of diabetes, the preliminary data shows that people in the lowest carb group who got more of their protein and fat from plant-based sources had 6% lower type 2 diabetes risk. And if they're eating further minimized sugar and other refined carbohydrates, they had a 15% lower risk. By contrast, the lowest carb group eating diets emphasizing animal protein and fat had 35% higher risk of type 2 diabetes and a 39% higher risk if their diets also minimized whole grains. All this is to say is that be careful, because some reduced carb diets may decrease diabetes risk, but others may raise it. And I may add that one of the reasons why this might be the case is that when you eat animal products or cheese or milk, these sorts of animal products have a sialic acid in it called Nu-5GC. And this Nu-5GC is foreign to the body, but gets incorporated whole and placed on the surface of your cells. And when your immune system sees this foreign antigen, it makes antibodies against it, and it can cause a low-level inflammatory condition, which, of course, is going to increase inflammation, and that is going to increase your chances of diabetes. So my recommendation would be to have a plant-based diet where you can get a lot of complex carbohydrates and also polyphenols. So if you are worried about diabetes, again, the recommendations would say that a vegetable-based low carbohydrate diet score that emphasizes vegetable protein and fat intake was associated with a 6% lower type 2 diabetes risk, and a healthy low carbohydrate diet score that further de-emphasizes refined carbohydrate intake was associated with a 15% lower type 2 diabetes risk. In contrast, diet scores emphasizing high animal protein and fat intake were associated with a higher type 2 diabetes risk. And the hazard ratios comparing extreme quintiles were 1.35 for an overall animal-based LCD score and 1.39 when the score further de-emphasized whole grain intake. So my recommendation is to cut back on animal products and increase whole grain food and natural products that contain complex carbohydrates like fruits and vegetables. I hope this has been